Let's discuss the impact of the war in Ukraine on food and energy prices. The war in Ukraine, as well as sanctions against Russia, has had a profound effect on both energy markets and food prices across the world. Developing and emerging economies are being hit the hardest due to their reliance on the region for fuel and grain imports, while price volatility, supply shortages, security issues, and economic uncertainty have contributed to what the International Energy Agency is calling the first truly global energy crisis, with impacts that will be felt for years to come. Ukraine and Russia provide more than half of the global exports of vegetable oils. The region also exports over a third of the world's wheat. Thus, the war has resulted in a massive decline in the supply of major staple foods. This has led to a rise in food prices globally. Poorer countries, many still recovering from the effects of the global pandemic, will bear the brunt of the negative consequences of the energy crisis and the increase of food prices. Which countries are bearing the brunt of the crisis? Food shortages precipitated by the war are hurting food prices everywhere, with the hardest hit being developing economies where the world's poorest live. Many developing and emerging market countries rely on food imported from Ukraine and Russia, known as the breadbasket of Europe, to augment local food production. Some of the top importers of Russian wheat are Turkey, Vietnam, and Indonesia, while Indonesia, the Philippines, and Morocco are among those that import the largest share of Ukrainian wheat. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization reports that the global food price index averaged 159.3 points in March 2022, up to 17.9 points or 12.6% from February. This is the highest level since its inception in 1990. The latest increase reflects new all-time highs for vegetable oils and cereals, highlighting the direct negative effect of the conflict. Focusing on country-level statistics, the largest leap in food price inflation between February and March 2022 has been in developing or emerging regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa. Several of these countries have experienced higher food price inflation than the global average over this period. For example, Lebanon with 396%, Zimbabwe 75%, and Turkey 70% experienced the highest rate of food price inflation between February and March.
If we can see what happens nowadays, I can say that the highest food price index, it is caused because of the the issues of the global supply chain. And I can say that, of course, it is the highest since the year 2000s, and I can say that nowadays the trend of the food price index going down, but I think when we compare what happened in 2008 and also 2011, I think this is the level quite the same with the crisis, food crisis in 2008 and 2011. And if you ask me Whether it might increase in this year or next year, well, of course, it depends on how is the situations in the global world, and we hope that we could anticipate the shortages of the food, and of course, like we have to anticipate how to fulfill food in the domestic economy.
Sanctions on Russian oil companies and the planned bans on Russian energy exports have triggered further increases in energy prices in the international market. While the European Union is still the largest collective buyer of Russian oil, buying 42% of Russia's oil output in 2021, the constituent countries have managed to diversify their economic base and begin importing more oil from elsewhere. In contrast, many developing or emerging markets are highly reliant on single basic resources, such as oil.
So of course, the countries that have a high reliance on import, that might have a big impacts on the food or the energy crisis. And then I can say that in that case, I can say we have to make sure that the international economic cooperation should take place in order to anticipate this food and energy crisis. And perhaps the agenda of the international forum like a G20, or even nowadays Indonesia become a chairman of ASEAN, I think the issues of energy crisis and also food crisis, especially the food security, should become a priority to be discussed, in the regional level and also in the global level.
I think we should understand that for a poorer country, option to respond the impact of the crisis are probably more limited than the other country with the higher economic status. So it is understandable that the poorer country should prioritize to rescue its economy, the essential needs of the people, and basically perform all necessary policy to protect its economy. In the long run, I think people need to consider how to diversify the country's energy mix, and also accelerate the development of alternative energy to strengthen our energy security.
Many of developing countries, or we also say emerging economies, are facing the burden due to the COVID crisis. So they have to spend a lot of their expenditure to finance most of social protection expense. And after that, there are also a new crisis, which is the war between Ukraine and also Russia. So it affects the price for the oil and also the food prices. And obviously, it will affect poor countries more significantly because they don't have any other source to finance these foods. And also, it will affect due to the import inflation. So maybe in terms of the ability for many of these developing countries to consume will be much smaller. So it obviously will affect these developing countries. So attention and also assistance to many of these poor countries will be very pivotal, because many people, or especially after the G20 meeting, we want to make sure that no one left behind. So we have to ensure that these poor countries can also be able to fulfill their basic needs, which is the energy and also the food security.
Consequently, movements in the international oil market affect local food prices in these markets. Eventually, the burden of higher costs of production, storage, and transport is passed on to the consumers in the form of higher food prices. What about for Southeast Asia? Disruptions in the supply of these commodities have consequently disrupted the economy of Southeast Asia. According to the World Bank, the conflict caused global prices of energy and food to rise by 50% and 20% respectively in 2022. The war in Ukraine is threatening Southeast Asia's post-COVID economic recovery. Although these countries have few direct economic links to Russia or Ukraine, the conflict is causing various commodity prices, especially oil, nickel, wheat, and corn, to surge. This is particularly concerning for Thailand, Vietnam, and Singapore as net importers of these commodities. The inflation rate for Southeast Asian countries increased from 3.1% in 2021 to 4.7% in 2022. Southeast Asia is reliant on and vulnerable to complex international food supply chains. The consequences of a food security crisis are very real, and as the pandemic weakens and as societies return to a semblance of normalcy, the region must adopt a new food security paradigm that can absorb and be reliant to both internal and external disruptions. Southeast Asia, because of its exposed vulnerability, must better understand the security-related aspects of food security and climate change.
For the reliance on the food import, I can say that Southeast Asia are the regions that I think have a good potential in producing food commodity. I still very optimistic, that Southeast Asia could survive in the current energy and food crisis. But as long as we have to make sure that the international economic cooperation still there, and also we have to make sure that the accessibility using the food trade can be optimized in order to fulfill food demands in the region and also in the specific country in Southeast Asia.
The commodity price hikes have had different effects across the region. This is unsurprising, as various factors, including the pace of their post-COVID economic rebound and different pace of demand recovery, influence flow-on effects. Government intervention, such as energy subsidies, could help ease the impacts of soaring oil prices on inflation, especially in Indonesia. Indeed, the global energy crisis has exposed weaknesses in energy systems across Southeast Asia and underpins a need for more ambitious energy transition pathways and a revised approach to energy security. Responding to pressures from inflation, the Philippines recently doubled its fuel subsidy program for public transport and also plans to increase the use of coal in electricity generation. Malaysia's oil subsidy has increased, while Indonesia has ramped up coal exports. Thailand and Vietnam also recently increased fossil fuel subsidies. Fuel subsidies in Indonesia accounted for around 0.6% of GDP in 2020, compared to 1.1% in Thailand and Vietnam in the same year. In Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, oil and energy consumption is relatively low, which could help curb the impacts of the oil price hike on inflation. In Singapore and Thailand, relatively high petrol and energy consumption will likely result in the oil price hike impacting domestic prices faster.
First is the magnitude of the crisis is different to each country. So it will depend on the exposure of that country to the main moving part in this crisis, which is the commodity price. And also, the impact it will depend mainly on the how these countries respond to the crisis. Country with larger fossil fuel component and fossil fuel portion in its energy system will get hit quicker and harder. And in that kind of situation, I think energy subsidy can function as an immediate response or rescue tool, but I can see it as only a short-term solutions. This kind of policy, especially for a country like Indonesia, actually is not viable in the long run.
Governments in Southeast Asia have also implemented price controls to combat rising commodity prices, which could limit long-term growth. Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam will probably suffer more than others, as per capita consumption of staple foods like wheat is relatively high. Still, price controls and direct subsidies for households will help soften the impact of food price hikes and limit the ability of firms to transfer these higher costs on to consumers. Although exporters like Indonesia and Malaysia can afford to subsidize the prices of commodities like chicken and cooking oil for now, doing so could cause longer-term declines in investment growth and increase public debt. The World Bank's East Asia and Pacific October 2022 Economic Update suggests some ways to improve fiscal efficiency, including providing targeted social assistance programs for vulnerable households who have experienced pandemic-related income shocks. So far, Southeast Asian countries have responded to the commodity crisis by prioritizing short-term economic goals at the cost of long-term decarbonization efforts. Yet, the crisis provides an opportunity for regional leaders to reorient future collaboration towards renewable energy and energy transition minerals. This will be necessary for sustainable development and protection against future supply shocks in an increasingly uncertain global environment and against guaranteed climate change. On the bright side, even though Southeast Asia's growth forecasts have somewhat been downgraded, ASEAN stock markets have remained relatively calm compared to other regions.
Yeah, I guess Asian region is still one of the most resilient region in the world. So I guess ADB has predicted that last year the growth for Asian countries was around 5.5%. But it's gonna be lower this year, especially due to some external factors. So the first one is, I guess, many major countries now are facing some decreasing in their economy, so it might impact the economy of Asian region. But compare Asian countries with other regions, I guess we are still more resilient. So one of the key factors is probably the demand from the domestic demand or consumption. So, for example, Indonesia, we have a quite robust consumption from domestic, so it will also affect the economy of Indonesia, and also it's similar to other Asian countries. Another factor is probably we are quite close to China, and China are now experiencing a recovery, so they are trying to make it more open, so they are removing the restriction policy, then that's why it will also increase possibly the demand from China. So I guess even though the growth is not as higher as before, but we are probably seeing an increase in or some we can say it like resilient in terms of the economy. Another factor is, I guess, also related to investment. So because we are talking about an area that is quite populous, there are a lot of population in Asia, so people or also investors are still looking at Asia as a potential place to invest their money. So I guess that will be probably the future of Asia in 2023. Yeah.
Although the region's growth outlook may have taken a hit due to the unforeseen geopolitical circumstances of 2022, the private sector seems optimistic that the growing middle class and a young, digitally literate population can drive new sectors of growth in the future. It is predicted that the region is likely to stay a bright spot in a world edging towards a recession.